mispronounced this author's name. I say Benica. It's Becca. Johannes Becke. This is a piece by Johannes Becke. It's titled Towards a De-Occidental Perspective on Israel, the Case of the Occupation. This is published with the Journal of Israeli History. Johannes Becke is Chair of Israel and Middle East Studies at Heidelberg University of Jewish Studies. His areas of interest are state and society in Israel, irredentism and territorial expansion, statehood and statelessness in the Middle East and North Africa, transculturation in Jewish-Arab relations, history of Israel studies. So here we go. This is the abstract for the piece. First fleshed out in German Romanticism, Occidentalist discourse expresses a regressive, conspiratorial, and anti-cosmopolitan critique of, quote, Western modernity. In a process mirroring the Orientalization of the Jews in Europe, the Jewish state in the Middle East underwent a process of Occidentalization, a phenomenon most apparent in depictions of Jewish diaspora nationalism as a form of European settler colonialism. In order to illustrate the research agenda of de-Occidentalizing Israel, two approaches are applied to the example of Israel's occupation. An analysis of pre-existing theorizations of Israel's territorial expansion after 1967 points to Occidentalist motifs like the systematic dislocation of Israel from its particular area and region, the neglect of Palestinian resistance, and the failure to develop a regionally comparative perspective. In contrast, a de-Occidentalist recontextualization of Israel as a post-colonial state in the Middle East points to intriguing parallels with other cases of post-colonial state expansion, like Syria's protectorate over Lebanon and Morocco's partial annexation of Western Sahara. So that's the abstract. And there starts with a quote, Zionism is in a sense a turning away from Europe and all it stands for. End quote. Albert Hourani, Syria and Lebanon, a political essay. Wikipedia says Albert Hourani lived from 1915 to 1993 and was a Lebanese-British historian specializing in the history of the Middle East and Middle Eastern studies. Introduction. One would be hard-pressed to guess in what geographical region, and precisely in what historical era, a country might be located that scholars compare to 15th century Spain. One second. Fuck. Sorry about that. Alright, here we go. One would be hard-pressed to guess in what geographical region, and precisely in what historical era, a country might be located that scholars compare to 15th century Spain. Walid Khalidi, 16th century England and 17th century South Africa, Donald Atkinson, and the 18th century United States, Baruch Kimmerling, or 19th century France, Ian Lustig, not to mention, of course, 20th century Nazi Germany, Joseph Mossad. Footnote, respectively, Khalidi, the Hebrew Reconquista of Palestine, Atkinson, God's Peoples, Kimmerling, Zionism and Territory, Lustig, Unsettled States, Mossad, article, The Persistence of the Palestinian Question. End footnote. The most common explanation for this dislocation of Israel from comparative research on the Middle East, crystallized in the budding field of Israel studies, focus on the detrimental feedback effects between geopolitical conflict and scholarly analysis, competing claims to moral exceptionalism, the, quote, artificial separation between Jewish and Oriental studies, end quote, or Israel's cultural hybridity given the population's, quote, somewhat Mediterranean look and flavor, not found in any other Western state, end quote. Barnett, in The Politics of Uniqueness. See Penslar, Israel and History, Poday's article, Israel in the Middle East, and Shmuha, Is Israel Western? End footnote. Foucauldian post-structuralists might feel tempted to analyze Israel as a heterotopia, a counter-site, or, quote, a kind of effectively enacted utopia, outside all places, most often linked to slices in time, which is to say that they open onto what might be termed, for the sake of symmetry, heterochronies, end quote. Foucault, in the article Of Other Spaces. Wikipedia says, heterotopia is a concept elaborated by philosopher Michel Foucault to describe certain cultural, institutional, and discursive spaces that are somehow, quote, other, disturbing, intense, incompatible, contradictory, or transforming. Heterotopias are, quote, worlds within worlds, end quote, both similar to their surroundings and contrasting with or upsetting them. Foucault provides examples: ships, cemeteries, bars, brothels, prisons, gardens of antiquity, fairs, Muslim baths, and many more. Foucault outlines the notion of heterotopia on 3 occasions between 1966 and 1967. A lecture given by Foucault to a group of architects in 1967 is the most well-known explanation of the term heterotopia. Foucault's first mention of heterotopia is in his preface to The Order of Things and refers to texts rather than socio-cultural spaces. Back to the text. In contrast, post-colonialists in the tradition of Homi Bhabha might trace this uncanny, quote, classificatory confusion back to centuries of Jewish colonial mimicry or strategic acculturation under both Christian and Islamic regimes of epistemological supremacy. Quote, the ambivalence of colonial authority repeatedly turns from mimicry, a difference that is almost nothing, but not quite, to menace, a difference that is almost total, but not quite, end quote. Homi Bhabha in the book The Location of Culture. One second. Wikipedia says Homi K. Bhabha, born 1949, is an Indian scholar and critical theorist. Homi Bhabha is the Anne F. Rothenberg Professor of the Humanities at Harvard University. Homi K. Bhabha is one of the most important figures in contemporary post-colonial studies and has developed a number of the field's neologisms and key concepts such as hybridity, mimicry, difference, and ambivalence. Such terms describe ways in which colonized people have resisted the power of the colonizer, according to Bhabha's theory. In 2012, Homi K. Bhabha received the Padma Bhushan Award in the field of literature and education from the Indian government. Homi K. Bhabha is married to attorney and Harvard lecturer Jacqueline Bhabha, and they have 3 children. Back to the text. In the case of the Jews in Europe, anxieties about this cultural ambivalence were frequently resolved by discursive orientalization. Footnote: see Kalmar and Penslar, Orientalism and the Jews. End footnote. This article analyzes the mirror image of this phenomenon, namely the Occidentalization of the Jewish state in the Middle East. More specifically, the article analyzes Israel's occupation as the focus, or in psychoanalytic terminology, the umbilicus, of this process of culturalist othering. Sorry, I was looking up umbilicus. I'm not finding anything good for it. Moving on. Footnote. See Derrida, Resistances of Psychoanalysis. The argument, end footnote. The argument is presented in 3 steps. First, the article discusses the discursive occidentalization of Israel as what Murray Edelman calls a quote condensation symbol. A highly evocative symbol that epitomizes the ontological difference between a fetishized colonizing quote Occident and the colonized quote Orient. Footnote, see Edelman, The Symbolic Uses of Politics, and Lazarus's article, The quote Fetish of the West in Postcolonial Theory, end quote. I think that's Neil Lazarus. I think that's in a book on Marxism and postcolonial theory. I'm not sure. It's definitely in a book about Marxism, though. Murray Edelman. I want to look up Murray Edelman. Wikipedia says Murray Edelman lived from 1919 to 2001, and was an American political scientist known for his research on symbolic politics and political psychology. Back to the text. The article suggests 2 interconnected approaches in order to de-Occidentalize Israel. While Occidentalist discourse analysis uncovers the traces and tropes of Occidentalist thinking, a de-Occidentalist perspective on Israel reconceptualizes the Jewish state as a post-colonial state in the Middle East. Second, the article applies the method of Occidentalist discourse analysis to the recent historiography of Israel's occupation. In principle, different Occidentalist understandings of Jewish nationalism are scattered among a wide variety of intellectual positions, ranging from Jewish ultra-Orthodoxy and radical diasporism to Arab nationalism and political third worldism. Israel's occupation, however, frequently serves as a bridging frame for these disparate intellectual movements who agree on hardly anything except for the characterization of Israel as, quote, a typically European, quote, colonial project, end quote, characterized by, quote, racial superiority and territorial expansion, end quote. Zitcher, The Image of Israel. The article, The Image of Israel. See Benford and Snow's article, Framing Processes. End footnote. A close reading of the recent historiography of Israel's occupation uncovers three trademarks of Occidentalism: a tendency to situate Israel outside of history, a systematic neglect of Palestinian resistance as, quote, heroic but vain, end quote, and a deep-seated exceptionalism. Footnote. See Cooper, Colonialism in Question. End footnote. Third, in order to make the case for a de-Occidentalist perspective that recontextualizes the Jewish state as a post-colonial state in the Middle East, the article develops a historical institutionalist argument for treating Israel's occupation as a case of post-colonial state expansion, typical of the third wave of irredentist projects during and after the process of colonization. And if you don't know, irredentism is, according to Wikipedia, I'll read it out. Irredentism is one state's desire to annex the territory of another state. This desire can be motivated by ethnic reasons because the population of the territory is ethnically similar to or the same as the population of the parent state. Historical reasons may also be responsible, i.e. that the territory previously formed part of the parent state. Difficulties in applying the concept to concrete cases have given rise to academic debates about its precise definition. Disagreements concern whether either or both ethnic and historical reasons have to be present, and whether non-state actors can also engage in irredentism. A further dispute is whether attempts to absorb a full neighboring state are also included. There are various types of irredentism. For typical forms of irredentism, the parent state already exists before the territorial conflict with a neighboring state arises. There are also forms of irredentism in which the parent state is newly created by uniting an ethnic group spread across several countries. Another distinction concerns whether the country to which the disputed territory currently belongs is a regular state, a former colony, or a collapsed state. A central research topic concerning irredentism is the question of how it is to be explained or what causes it. Many explanations hold that ethnic homogeneity within a state makes irredentism more likely. Discrimination against the ethnic group in the neighboring territory is another contributing factor. A closely related explanation argues that national identities, based primarily on ethnicity, culture, and history, increase irredentist tendencies. Another approach is to explain irredentism as an attempt to increase power and wealth. In this regard, it is argued that irredentist claims are more likely if the neighboring country is relatively rich. Many explanations also focus on the regime type and hold that democracies are less likely to engage in irredentism, while anocracies are particularly open to irredentism. Irredentism has been an influential force in world politics since the mid-19th century. It has been responsible for many armed conflicts, even though international law is hostile to irredentism, and irredentist movements often fail to achieve their goals. The term was originally coined from the Italian phrase Italia irredenta and referred to an Italian movement after 1878 claiming parts of Switzerland and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Often discussed cases of irredentism include Nazi Germany's annexation of the Sudetenland in 1938, Somalia's invasion of Ethiopia in 1977, Argentina's invasion of the Falkland Islands in 1982. Further examples are attempts to establish a Greater Serbia following the breakup of Yugoslavia in the early 1990s, Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014. Irredentism is closely related to revanchism and secession. Revanchism is an attempt to annex territory belonging to another state. It is motivated by the goal of taking revenge for a previous grievance, in contrast to the goal of irredentism of building an ethnically unified nation state. In the case of succession, a territory breaks away and forms an independent state instead of merging with another state. Back to the text. Footnote See Endelman, Introduction, Adelman, The Rise of Israel, and Shimoni's article, Postcolonial Theory. New section, Israel and Occidentalism. Recent developments in research on Israel point to a laudable trend of investigating historical parallels between the Zionist project and other Jewish societies, revolutionary states, or movements of national liberation by colonized people. Footnote, see Chazan article, Irredentism, Separatism, and Nationalism. Perhaps the most elaborate response to repeated calls to expand this comparativist endeavor into an analysis of Israeli institution building as a case of post-colonial state formation is Derek Penslar's nuanced application of Partha Chatterjee's framework of post-colonial nationalism, quote, by placing Zionism in Asia, as it were, end quote. See Penslar, Israel in History, and Chatterjee, The Nation and Its Fragments, and Borelli's article, Forgetting Europe. Wikipedia says it says Derek Penslar is an American-Canadian comparative historian with interest in the relationship between modern Israel and diaspora Jewish societies, global nationalist movements, European colonialism, and post-colonial states. Back to the text. Partha Chatterjee. Partha Chatterjee, born 1947, is an Indian political scientist and anthropologist. Partha Chatterjee was the director of the Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta, from 1997 to 2007, and continues as an honorary professor of political science. Partha Chatterjee is also a professor of anthropology and South Asian studies at Columbia University and a member of the Subaltern Studies Collective. Back to the text. But even Derek Penslar's comprehensive argument that, quote, the Zionist project was historically and conceptually situated between colonial, anti-colonial, and post-colonial discourse and practice, unquote, stops short of engaging the causal links between post-colonial state formation and Israel's territorial expansion after the Six-Day War by claiming that, quote, post-1967, Israel became not only a colonial state, but also an imperial one, end quote. Derek Penslar. From a global historical perspective, the idea that after 1967, quote, Israel underwent a rapid evolution into a colonial state, end quote. Derek Penslar. Is a surprising categorization since similar policies of systematic demographic engineering were undertaken by a broad variety of post-colonial states in order to establish political control and a more legitimate claim to contested territories throughout the process of decolonization. Footnote, see Weiner and Teitelbaum's book, Political Demography. Examples of, quote, strategic settlement projects, unquote, by post-colonial states include the establishment of Han Chinese settlers in Tibet and Xinjiang, Indian settlers in the disputed mountain ranges close to China, Indonesian settlers in East Timor and West Papua, Moroccan settlers in Western Sahara, and hundreds of thousands of Syrian migrant workers in Lebanon. Footnote, see Norbu's article, Economic Policy and Practice in Contemporary Tibet. See Halskov Hansen's article, The Call of Mao or Money. See Kapoor's book, The China-India-Pakistan Strategic Relationship. Dunn's article, Genocide in East Timor. Chevelle's article, Refugee, Displacement and Dispossession. And Chalcraft, The Invisible Cage. So what explains the widespread back to the end footnote. So what explains the widespread exceptionalism vis-a-vis Israel's territorial expansion and the ensuing occupation in both scholarly and political discourse? This article argues that the phenomenon can be traced back to the discursive formation of Occidentalism. Echoing Edward Said's critique of Orientalism, one might argue that Israel, through the prism of Occidentalism, is not Israel as Israel is, but Israel as it has been Occidentalized. See Said's Orientalism, the book. The use of the term, see Said's Orientalism, the book. The use of the term, quote, Occidentalism follows Ian Baruma and Avishai Margalit's Occidentalism book, and should be distinguished from the term, quote, Occidentalism / quote, post-Occidentalism, end quote, employed in Latin American post-colonial studies, which might be translated more adequately as, quote, Westernism and, quote, post-Westernism, end quote. Footnote, see Buruma and Margalit, Occidentalism. See Mignolo, Local History / Global Designs. Check out the piece on here by Neil Larson about called the Jargon of Decoloniality, which is a critique of Mignolo. And yeah. Back end footnote. In the latter context, it is understood as, quote, not the reverse of Orientalism, but Orientalism's condition of possibility, Orientalism's dark side, as in a mirror, end quote. Coronil, in the article Beyond Occidentalism. Consequently, the focus of analysis shifts from stereotypical representations in an exotic Orient to the colonial self-image, or, quote, the concerns and images of the Occident that underwrite their representations of non-Western societies, whether in the Orient or elsewhere, end quote. Coronil. Hold on, I wanted to look some of these people up, actually, that I didn't look up. Ian Buruma. Wikipedia says Ian Buruma, born 1951, is a Dutch writer and editor who works and lives in the United States. In 2017, Ian Buruma became editor of the New York Review of Books, but left the position in September 2018. Much of his writing is focused on the culture of Asia, particularly that of China and 20th century Japan. Ian Buruma was the Paul W. Williams Professor of Human Rights and Journalism at Bard College from 2003 to 2017. Avishai Margalit is an Israeli professor emeritus in philosophy at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem from 2006 to 2011. Avishai Margalit served as the George F. Kennan Professor at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. Back to the text. I wanted to look up their book. That's what I wanted to look up. I'm not going to look up every book that's cited, but this one's in the actual text proper and not in the footnotes, so I want to look it up. Occidentalism, The West in the Eyes of Its Enemies, by Ian Buruma and Avishai Margalit. The book description says, 25 years ago, Edward Said's Orientalism, the book, spawned a generation of scholarship on the denigrating and dangerous mirage of the, quote, East in the Western colonial mind, but, quote, the West, and, quote, is the more dangerous mirage of our own time. Ian Buruma and Avishai Margalit argue, and the idea of, quote, the West, and, quote, in the minds of its self-proclaimed enemies remain largely unexamined and woefully misunderstood. Occidentalism is their groundbreaking investigation of the demonizing fantasies and stereotypes about the Western world that fuel such hatred in the hearts of others. We generally understand, quote, radical Islam, end quote, as a purely Islamic phenomenon, but Buruma and Margalit show that while the Islamic part of radical Islam certainly is, the radical part owes a primary debt to the inheritance of the West, inheritance to the West. Whatever else they are, Al-Qaeda and its ilk are revolutionary anti-Western political movements, and Buruma and Margalit show us that the boogeyman of the West who stalks their thinking is the same one who has haunted the thoughts of many other revolutionary groups going back to the 19th century. In this genealogy of the components of the anti-Western worldview, the same oppositions appear again and again. The heroic revolutionary versus the timid, soft bourgeois, the rootless, deracinated cosmopolitan living in the Western city, cut off from the roots of spiritually healthy society, the sterile Western mind, all reason and no soul, the machine society, controlled from the center by a cabal of insiders, often Jews, pulling the hidden levers of power, versus an organically knit together one, a society of, quote, blood in the soil, end quote. The anti-Western virus has found a ready host in the Islamic world for a number of legitimate reasons, they argue, but in no way does that make it an exclusively Islamic matter. Back to the text. I'm not sure exactly where I left off. Consequently, the focus of analysis shifts from stereotypical representations of an exotic Orient to the colonial self-image, or, quote, the concerns and images of the Occident that underwrite their representations of non-Western societies, whether in the Orient or elsewhere, end quote. Cornel. In contrast, Buruma and Margalit discuss Occidentalism as a regressive, conspiratorial, and anti-cosmopolitan critique of, quote, Western and, quote, modernity. They argue that the assumption of highly specific, pernicious, and time-transcending features that constitute the discursive fiction of the, quote, Occident is much older than the Arab-Israeli conflict. Occidentalism also predates, quote, Orientalism in reverse, end quote, or self-orientalization, a process that maintains the binary distinction between, quote, Europe and, quote, Asia, but switches the moral connotation. Footnote, see Al-Azam, who I think is a Marxist, if I'm not... Yeah. I'm pretty sure he's a Marxist. Where the hell am I? While Orientalism in reverse adopts Western assumptions about the eternal nature of the Orient in order to celebrate the Orient in a display of ostentatious self-empowerment, while Orientalism in reverse adopts Western assumptions about the eternal nature of the Orient in order to celebrate the eternal nature, these Western assumptions about the eternal nature of the Orient in a display of ostentatious self-empowerment, Occidentalism can be described as a, quote, process of alienation and objectification of the West into a kind of explanation in which specific issues and concerns are blended into a cultural definition of otherness applicable to every and all situations, end quote. Yofa, confrontational mutual perceptions and images. Buruma and Margalit trace Occidentalist thought back to early criticisms of capitalist modernity, fleshed out most systematically in German Romanticism, quote, for the first Occidentalists were Europeans, end quote. Yeah, I was going to say that the description made it sound like the anti-Westerners were like the revolutionary Republicans or like socialists, but that description doesn't seem to make much sense. Yeah. Anyway, as Margalit and what was his name, Buruma, point out, since Occidentalism is culturally non-specific, Occidentalism's discursive patterns can easily be diffused across civilizational boundaries in order to be translated and localized into the discursive structure of such diverse frameworks as Japanese nationalism, German fascism, or political Islam. Yet, the common binary motifs of Occidentalism tend to survive these processes of conceptual translation. When, for instance, the soulless cosmopolitan city is contrasted to the authentic village of, quote, natives, end quote. The self-interested materialist merchant to the self-sacrificing warrior. The scientific rationalist mind to holistic intuitive spirituality. And moral degeneracy to hard-earned puritanical virtue. The problematic nature of Occidentalism consists not in the obvious diagnosis that Israel, despite being, quote, a society built by non-Westerners, end quote, Smuha, that's the author in an article titled Israel Western, is closer to the model of Western modernity than Israel's neighbors in terms of economic development, democratic institution building, and general way of life, but in a culturalist fundamental attribution error, quote, a tendency for people to make dispositional attributions for others, end quote, behavior, even when there are clear external/environmental causes, end quote. See Hogg and Vaughan, Social Psychology. By identifying Israel as part of the global, quote, West, explanations of Israel's state formation, including Israel's territorial expansion, focus not on strategic interaction, regional power dynamics, or historical context, but on presumed deep-seated and time-transcending characteristics, notably a colonizing will to power, a rootless and cosmopolitan civilization, disdain for the, quote, natives, and an unquenchable thirst for material resources. In the jargon of Lacanian psychoanalysis, Israel's occidentalization can thus be described as a process of discursive Entstellung, distortion, by Verdichtung, condensation into the metaphor of a fictitious Occident. Jesus Christ, it's hard to follow. See Lacan, Écrit, or Écrit. I guess that's writings. That's my guess. Can't find anything good for these. Occidentalist depictions of Israel as the epitome of the dark side of European modernity are rarely as pithy and easily discernible as Ahmed Sukairi's claim that, quote, Zionism was nastier than fascism, uglier than Nazism, more hateful than imperialism, more dangerous than colonialism, end quote. See, what's the source? Footnote. See Harkabi, Arab Attitudes to Israel, end footnote. Ahmed al-Sukairi, also translated al-Shukairi or Shukeri. There's like a million different ways people have said it. Lived from 1908 to 1980 and was a Palestinian political leader and first chairman of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, serving from 1964 to 1967. Back to the text. More often, Occidentalist motifs are woven into representation of the Jewish state with more subtlety and arguably with considerably less malign intent. Take, for instance, a common textbook on modern state formation in the Middle East by Roger Owen, which nonchalantly depicts Zionist immigration to the land of Israel as part of a broader process of establishing, quote, local European settler communities, whether of the same nationality as the ruling power, like the French in Algeria, or another like most of the Jews in Palestine, end quote. Wikipedia says Roger Owen lived from 1935 to 2018, and was a British historian specializing in the modern Middle East, particularly the economic, social, and political history of Egypt from 1800 onward. Roger Owen's work also explored theories of imperialism and military occupations. Owen authored several influential books and held prominent academic positions, including professorships at University of Oxford and Harvard University. Back to the text. A closer look at nationalist symbols such as language and flag might have revealed that these Zionist immigrants claimed a Hebrew rather than, quote, another, end quote, parenthesis, which precisely, question mark, in parenthesis, European nationality. Many among them might even have expressed strongly, quote, anti-European and anti-Western sentiments, end quote. Footnote. Reinhardt and Schwitt describe 5 anti-European, or rather anti-Eurocentric positions in Jewish Zionist discourse that might be distinguished as Zionist Occidentalism, calling for a physical withdrawal from Europe as, quote, an inferior culture, one that was superficial and nihilistic, end quote, the Jewish Orthodox rejection of, quote, Hellenization, and the culture, quote, culture of Japhet, unquote, folkish, ontaic mysticism related to the return to the ancient homeland, Canaanite opposition to the, quote, European character of Palestine's Jewish culture, end quote, and the critique of Ashkenazi Eurocentrism by Sephardic post-colonialists. See Reinhardt and Schwitt, Glorious Accursed Europe, the book. End footnote. But Owen does not stop at the culturalist Occidentalism of Zionist. But Owen does not stop at the culturalist Occidentalization of Zionist immigrants as, quote, European settlers, end quote. In a curious anachronism of racialized Occidentalization, Owen speaks of the, quote, presence of a white settler community in Palestine, end quote. Roger Owen, State, Power, and Politics. Zionist immigration to the land of Israel as the establishment of a, quote, white settler community, end quote, question mark. This fairly mainstream textbook passage would have surprised not only those Jewish immigrants fleeing European anti-Semitism precisely as non-whites, but even more so their non-Jewish contemporaries among Owen's predecessors at Harvard, constantly worried about the admission rate for members of the, quote, Hebrew race, end quote. And even Lord Balfour himself, who famously warned of, quote, a people apart, end quote, in his defense of the 1905 Aliens Act directed against Jewish immigration to the United Kingdom. In other words, while 19th century Orientalization turned the Jews in Europe into a, quote, Orientalicious Fremdlingsfolk, a foreign Asiatic people, end quote, 20th century Occidentalization turned the Jewish state in the Middle East into a, quote, white settler community, end quote. Where am I? Similar to Orientalism, different forms of Occidentalism can be distinguished. Academic or pseudo-academic Occidentalism as manifested in research on Western cultures and societies, ontological Occidentalism as the assumption of a stable ontological difference between, quote, Europe and, quote, Asia, and political Occidentalism as the array of strategies to counter, undermine, and overturn alleged strategies of Western expansionism. The State of Israel plays a central role in all three forms of Occidentalism, or rather, the Occidentalist cliche of Israel is, quote, the symbol of idolatrous, hubristic, amoral colonial evil, a cancer in the eyes of Israel's enemies that must be expunged by killing, end quote. Buruma and Margalit, Occidentalism. Israel represents a core issue for academic Occidentalism, most prevalent in the discipline of post-colonial studies, is frequently portrayed as a civilizational fault line in ontological Occidentalism, and constitutes a key bridging frame for political Occidentalism, Third Worldism. Within academic Occidentalism, Israel is allocated a central place in the discipline of post-colonial studies, where Israel is frequently analyzed as, quote, a typically European, quote, colonial project, end quote, characterized by, quote, racial and, quote, superiority and territorial expansion, end quote. Zitcher's article, The Image of Israel. The discipline's normative hierarchy of, quote, Palestine at the top, followed by the Arab nation and the Islamic world, as the long-suffering victims of Western racism, American imperialism, and Israeli Zionism, end quote. Kramer, Ivory Towers on Sand, can only partially be traced back to Edward Said. In fact, Edward Said's Palestinian nationalism should rather be considered as the root cause for the diffusion of Said's work, despite numerous shortcomings. In the same way that Said's depiction of a time-transcending discursive formation of Orientalism, quote, simply lends strength to the essentialistic categories of, quote, Orient and, quote, Occident, representing the ineradicable distinction between East and West, which Said is ostensibly set on demolishing, end quote. Al-Azam. Occidentalist categories dominate Said's analysis of the Arab-Israeli conflict, crystallized in his claim that, quote, so far as the Arab-Palestinian is concerned, the Zionist project for and conquest of Palestine was simply the most successful and to date the most protracted of many such European projects since the Middle Ages, end quote. Said, The Question of Palestine. Israel is thereby turned into a central symbol of ontological Occidentalism, a position that assumes that the creation of a tiny Jewish state in the ancient Jewish homeland somehow reveals profound and meaningful insights into the deeper nature of civilizational fault lines. As an ontological assumption, this position is fairly immune to empirical refutation, although many valid arguments have been raised, for instance against what Avi Bareli terms the, quote, colonialist school, end quote, in Israeli historiography that interprets Jewish diaspora nationalism as a case of European settler colonialism. The Zionist movement had no metropole, Zionist settlement did not aim at economic enrichment. Jewish immigrants did not politically control the territory. Support by imperial powers shifted. In the end, Jewish independence had to be imposed against colonial Great Britain. The Zionist movement neither exploited local labor nor intended to spread any civilizing mission. And of course, unlike British settlers in Aotearoa, New Zealand, Jewish immigrants could point to centuries of cultural, religious, economic, and migratory ties to the land of Israel. Yet by definition, empirical arguments cannot refute ontological assumptions. Therefore, ontological Occidentalists will inevitably trace even the most contradictory and hybridized cultural tendencies back to their own axiomatic dichotomies. For instance, planning Tel Aviv according to contemporary European architectural standards allegedly expresses, quote, the inherently colonial constitution of the project of modernity, end quote. Levine, Overthrowing Geography. While enjoying contemporary Middle Eastern cuisine follows the hidden colonial logic of the, quote, Israeli cultural theft and appropriation of falafel and hummus, traditional Palestinian and Levantine Arab dishes, as Israeli Jewish dishes, or dabka, traditional Palestinian and Levantine Arab line dancing, as Israeli Jewish folk dancing, end quote. Joseph Massad. Historically, this phenomenon can be traced back to the earliest days of mutual culturalist projections in the struggle between Jewish and Palestinian nationalism. Quote, each had tended more and more to identify the other with the main opponents which it is fighting, the Zionists bringing with them into Palestine the outlook of the dispersion, regard Arab hostility to them as only another aspect of that blind, unreasonable anti-Semitism which they have known in Europe. They think of the Arab nationalists as fascists or as mercenary tools of the fascists. The Arabs on their side see in the Zionists those European characteristics which they particularly resent, the arrogance and disrespect for tradition. The Arabs regard Zionism as an example of that Western penetration, which is essential for them to control and to meet on equal terms, if their whole heritage is not to be destroyed. More particularly, they regard it as the tool, the partner, even the master of Western imperialism, end quote. Hurani, Syria and Lebanon. The Palestinian identification of Jewish immigrants as, quote, European settlers, end quote, should therefore not be dismissed as a, quote, consciously worked out Machiavellian myth, end quote. Indeed, cultural alienation, more so than political domination, is the overwhelming argument in the earliest Occidentalist literature that identifies Israel as a, quote, settler colonial state, end quote, due to the, quote, introduction of a foreign element to the detriment of an indigenous population, parenthesis, in the usual meaning of these terms, end parenthesis, end quote. Rodinson, Israel. Yet in addition to, quote, a certain and sad irony in describing the Zionist and the migration movement that they created as a movement of Europeans to the east, since the Jews were in effect expelled from Europe in a long, painful, and complex process that reached its horrible nadir in the mid-20th century, end quote. Barelli. This culturalist proxy war seems bizarre in its projection of grandiose narratives on a territorial struggle between two fairly similar national movements over the same tiny piece of land in the Middle East. Footnote on learning and mirroring effects between Jewish and Palestinian nationalism, see Al-Azm, Palestinian Zionism. End footnote. In a way, the Occidentalist reading seems as unconvincing as the proxy war narrative in the Cold War, which interpreted a clash between two forms of militarized state socialism, with respectively Jewish nationalist or Arab nationalist flavors, as a struggle between, quote, liberal democracy and, quote, communism. Historically, contemporary ontological Occidentalism could be understood as the intellectual legacy of political Occidentalism, especially the indeterminate third worldism of what Benjamin Revlin and Jacques Fomerand term a somewhat hodgepodge, quote, tricontinental anti-Israel coalition, end quote. The narrative of Israel as an alleged, quote, settler colonial state, end quote, provide a strong and maybe the only bridging frame. Wikipedia says Benjamin Revlin. I don't know if this is the right guy. No, this is not the right guy. Here's the other guy, Jacques Fomerand. Not really finding any good descriptions of these people. This phenomenon is concisely captured in Rivlin and Fomerand's description of the Non-Aligned Movement Summit in Algiers in September 1973, which became, quote, bogged down in disagreement and squabbling among delegates, most notably between Gaddafi and Castro. The Third World was finding it difficult to speak with a single voice, and the conference appeared on the verge of collapse, end quote. It was only the question of the Middle East that, quote, enabled all the participants to end the conference on a note of agreement, at least on one issue, condemnation of Israel. Israel was unambiguously bracketed with Portugal, South Africa, and Rhodesia as a colonialist and racist state, and the Palestinians with liberation movements in Africa and Southeast Asia, end quote. Rivlin and Fomerand, this article, Changing Third World Perspectives. After the demise of Third Worldism, transnational political Occidentalism is nowadays largely reduced to querfront or cross-front alliances between anti-Zionists from the radical socialist left and the radical Islamist right on British university campuses or in the comment section of Al Jazeera's English language website. Again, Al Jazeera being the state media of a monarchy with connections to the Muslim Brotherhood. Yet both ontological and academic Occidentalism are alive and kicking, as the mirror image of Israeli Orientalism towards the Arab world. Occidentalism forms the backbone of the, quote, politics of uniqueness, end quote, that prevents comparative research on Israel and its neighbors, although in principle, quote, neither Zion nor Palestine convey any epistemological or moral privilege, end quote. Halliday. Quote Halliday's article, Orientalism and Its Critics. I have a piece on here by Halliday, I'm sure it's Fred Halliday, on this channel titled The Perils of Community, a critique of nationalist ideology. Yeah. It's a very good piece. It's on this channel. You should check it out. Also, Fred Halliday was an editor of New Left Review. New section. The persistence of Occidentalism. To the theologically informed reader, the rhetoric of outrage and Occidentalist discourse on Israel, such as the claim that, quote, the plight of the Palestinians is worse than was that of black South Africans under apartheid, and Tel Aviv's behavior is more harshly expansionist than Pretoria's, end quote, rings of the age-old Gentile resentment against the doctrine of Israel's election as the, quote, scandalon of sovereign grace, end quote. Glazer, Zionism and Apartheid, and Bukover, Divine Election. Rashi captures this argument in his commentary on the opening verse of the book of Genesis. Quote, for if the nations of the world should say to Israel, you are robbers because you have conquered the lands of the 7 nations of Canaan, they, Israel, could say to them, quote, the entire world belongs to the Holy One. Blessed be he created it and gave it to whomever it was right in his eye. Of his own will he gave it to them, and of his own will he took it from them and gave it to us. End quote. Quoted from Lorberbaum, Making and Unmaking the Boundaries of Holy Land. To the less theologically inclined readers, motifs of Occidentalist discourse might not bear the trace of resentment, but of resistance. Following James C. Scott's conceptualization of infrapolitics as, quote, essentially the strategic form that the resistance of subjects must assume under conditions of great peril, end quote. James C. Scott, Domination and the Arts of Resistance. The Occidentalization of Israel's rule over the occupied territories after 1967 could best be understood as the, quote, hidden transcript, end quote, of a population under siege. Scott defines this, quote, hidden transcript, end quote, as a, quote, collective cultural product, whatever form it assumes, offstage parody, dreams of violent revenge, millennial visions of a world turned upside down. This collective hidden transcript is essential to any dynamic view of power relations, end quote. Scott, Domination and the Arts of Resistance. The widespread diffusion of Occidentalist motifs as the subversion not just of Israel's irredentist claims to the West Bank and Gaza, but of the legitimacy of Jewish diaspora nationalism altogether, should thus be understood as one of the more successful chapters of Palestinian resistance against Israel's occupation. Yet even as a, quote, hidden transcript, end quote, Occidentalist perspectives on Israel's occupation as the endeavor of a, quote, settler colonial state, end quote, cannot be outright rejected as pure fabrication. Robert Wistrich indeed traces surprising amounts of contemporary Occidentalist rhetoric back to Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda throughout the Cold War. Quote, the USSR publicly encouraged ... equations of Zionism with anti-Semitism, fascism, and Nazism at the United Nations. Indeed, as early as 1965, the Soviets had formally proposed that Zionism be linked to colonialism, racism, and other imperialist evils, end quote. Robert Wistrich, A Lethal Obsession. But Wistrich notes himself with regards to Israel's colonization of the occupied territories, quote, as with many caricatures, one may reject the exaggeration in this picture, yet recognize the grain of truth without which it would be inconceivable that people who are by no means anti-Semites could come to believe in such simplistic notions, end quote. Wistrich, Left-wing anti-Zionism in Western societies. The persistence of Occidentalist discourse on Israel as a, quote, settler colonial, end quote, state could thus be historicized as a time-specific third worldist argument about the legitimacy of Israel has gained additional persuasive power and analytical value based on Israel's colonization of the occupied territories after 1965. Yet the diffusion of Occidentalist motifs can also be traced back to their constitutive value. Occidentalism constitutes collective identities, alleviates anxieties about cultural hybridity, and enables the claim to subject positions of moral and ethnic privilege. For Arab anti-Zionism, the Occidentalization of Israel is, quote, simply the most successful and to date the most protracted of many such European projects since the Middle Ages, end quote. Said, The Question of Palestine, is critical to alleviate anxieties about the deeply uncanny nature of Jewish nationalism. While the migratory return of dispersed Jewish natives to their ancestral homeland uncovered the repressed trauma of the Arab colonized of large parts of the Middle East, the Zionist call for self-rule as a, quote, demi-rebellion, end quote, reveals the epistemological violence behind the Islamic claim to a civilizing mission. Footnote, see Nissan Minorities in the Middle East. Freud interprets the uncanny as, quote, something repressed which recurs, end quote, arguing that, quote, linguistic usage is extended das Heimliche, bracket, homely, end bracket, into its opposite, das Unheimliche. For this uncanny is in reality nothing new or alien, but something which is familiar and old established in the mind and which has become alienated from it only through the process of repression, end quote. Freud, The Uncanny. End footnote. For Jewish opposition to Zionism, the Occidentalization of Jewish diaspora nationalism accords with the racialized identity politics of post-Zionist soul-searching. Depicting Zionism as, quote, European settler colonialism, end quote, makes Ashkenazi Jews a bit more white and Sephardic Jews a bit less so. Footnote, in other cases, Occidentalist perspectives serve the function of establishing inner Ashkenazi cultural hierarchies. Ilan Pape's depiction of Zionism as, quote, shtetl colonialism, end quote, for instance, echoes the condescension of assimilated pre-Shoah German Jewry vis-a-vis their lesser brethren, the Ostjuden, or Eastern Jews, or Jews of the East. See Pape's article, Shtetl Colonialism. End footnote. In a peculiar struggle for ethnic privilege, the Occidentalization of Jewish nationalism enables Sephardic post-Zionists to retroactively reimagine themselves as, quote, Arab, end quote, Jews, and, quote, victims, end quote, of Zionism, snatched from, quote, their Arab homelands, end quote. Shinhav, the Arab Jews. See Shohat's article, Sephardim in Israel and Chetrit, Intra-Jewish Conflict in Israel. End footnote. At the same time, Occidentalism provides Ashkenazi post-Zionists with the opportunity of reinventing themselves as, quote, white Sabras. What the hell is a Sabra? A Jewish person born in Israel. Wikipedia says, in modern Hebrew, the term Sabra refers to Israeli-born Jews, derived from the Hebrew name for the prickly pear cactus, which is commonly spelled Sabra in English. The words had come to widespread use by the 1930s, when they were used to designate a Jewish person whose place of birth was located within the land of Israel, corresponding with Ottoman Syria until 1918, Od Yeshuv, and with the British Mandate of Palestine until 1948, New Yeshuv, though it may have appeared earlier. Sabra is understood to be a term that is used to allude to the collective nature of Israeli Jews. It is a tenacious and thorny desert plant with a thick skin that conceals a sweet and soft interior. The description is the basis for the design of Srulik, a cartoon character that represents the average Sabra and thus serves as Israel's national personification. In 2010, over 70% of Israel's Jewish population was composed of Sabras, with this figure increasing to 75% in 2015 and 80% in 2024. End footnote. Back to the text. At the same time, Occidentalism provides Ashkenazi post-Zionists with the opportunity of reinventing themselves as, quote, white Sabras, equipped with the dubious privilege of white guilt, quote, a validation of white liberal superiority as a more sensitized and thus more refined whiteness, end quote. Benvenisti. See footnote. See Lopez's article, Whiteness After Empire. Interestingly, Richard Dyer's seminal phrasing of the Zundenstolz, pride in being a repentant sinner, dynamics behind white guilt aptly captures the underlying palimpsest of a decidedly Christian theology of original sin. Quote, we may lacerate ourselves with admission of our guilt, but what bears witness to the fineness of a moral spirit that can feel such guilt? The display of our guilt is our Calvary. End quote. Richard Dyer. End footnote. For European non-Jews, the Occidentalization of Israel as, quote, the incarnation of the negative properties Europe has succeeded in overcoming, its colonial past, its ethnic divisions, its institutionalized racism, its excess of violence, end quote, serve the critical function of providing a vessel, quote, into which Europe can project all that is violent in Europe's own past and present and preserve the good for itself, end quote. Fine. In the article Fighting with Phantoms. And that's Robert Fine. Finally, especially for the political left in the historical European settler colonial states throughout the Commonwealth and in Latin America, the Occidentalization of Jewish diaspora nationalism helps to alleviate anxieties about repressed coloniality in the remarkable attempt to become, in the words of Nicaraguan President Daniel Ortega, quote, every day, ... more anti-imperialist, more anti-racist, more anti-Zionist, more anti-apartheid, more anti-colonialist, more anti-neocolonialist, end quote. Lehrman, quote, fictive anti-Zionism. What's the piece by Lehrman? Lehrman, fictive anti-Zionism, Third World, Arab and Muslim variations. End footnote. New section. De-Occidentalizing Israel. Israel's Occidentalization is so entrenched that the research agenda of de-Occidentalizing the Jewish state consists in a double movement, uncovering Occidentalist motifs in both political and scholarly discourse, and suggesting alternative paradigms that privilege common institutional legacies of both Israel and Israel's Arab neighbors in order to highlight their shared characteristics as post-colonial and, in principle, post-Ottoman states. Footnote: the perspective on Israel as a post-Ottoman state was suggested to me by Yossi Harpatz. End footnote. This process of de-Occidentalization should be carried out carefully in order to avoid two potential fallacies: the fallacy of reorientalization and the fallacy of a collapse into Eurocentricity. Concerning the fallacy of reorientalization, the project of de-Occidentalization should explicitly not be misunderstood as the idea of reorientalizing the Jewish state by claiming the Jewish state to be part and parcel of the, quote, Orient, because allegedly, when, quote, viewed from the perspective of history, culture, demography, and temperament, ... Israel can rightly be considered a normal Middle Eastern state, end quote. And that quote is from Nissim Rejwan, Israel's Place in the Middle East, A Pluralist Perspective, published in 1998. Quite a few characteristics of Israel's history do stand out in comparison to Israel's neighbors, and it would be outright absurd to deny the, quote, eccentric aspects of Jewish nation building, i.e. colonizing an inhabited land in the name of return to an ancient home, end quote. Derek Jonathan Penslar, Israel and History, The Jewish State in Comparative Perspective, published in 2007. Not every structured comparison between Israeli and European statecraft, including practices of European colonialism, ! Should therefore be accused of engaging in Occidentalism, for the analysis of legitimation strategies as a tool of coalition building Within liberal democracies, Stacey Goddard's careful comparison between Israel and Northern Ireland could hardly be replaced with a case study comparing Knesset politics to the arcane wheeling and dealing inside the Moroccan Machzen, the patronage network surrounding the royal palace, even though the idea sounds enticing. Footnote. Goddard, Stacey E. Goddard, Invisible Territory and the Politics of Legitimacy, published in 2010. I'll look up Stacey Goddard since she was mentioned in the text. Wikipedia says Stacey E. Goddard, is that who I'm looking for? Is an American political scientist. She is the Mildred Lane Kemper Professor of Political Science at Wellesley College. Goddard is known for her research on international order, grand strategy, and global power politics. Goddard formerly served as the faculty director of the Madeleine Corbel Albright Institute for Global Affairs and is a non-resident fellow of the Quincy Institute. And I wanted to look up and if you don't know, the Knesset is Israeli parliament. Wikipedia says Machzen is the governing institution in Morocco and in pre-1957 Tunisia, centered on the monarch and consisting of royal notables, top-ranking military personnel, landowners, security service bosses, civil servants, and well-connected members of the establishment. The term Machzen is also popularly used in Morocco as a word meaning, quote, state or, quote, government. And back to the text. For a study of the reversibility of territorial expansion as part of the struggle over cultural hegemony within democratic institutions, Ian Lustig's case selection of comparing Israel's control over the West Bank and Gaza with Great Britain and Ireland, 1834 to 1922, and France and Algeria, 1936 to 1962, might be justified, although crucial features of the essentially contested nature of post-colonial states in the Middle East are lost in comparison. Wikipedia says Ian Lustig is an American political scientist and specialist on the modern history and politics of the Middle East. He currently holds the Bess W. Hyman Chair in the Department of Political Sciences at the University of Pennsylvania. Yet with regard to Israel's occupations, equations with European colonialism inevitably tend to fall short when it comes to explaining and categorizing the original moment of state expansion. France and Great Britain established colonies beyond the sea as a typical state practice of European imperialism. Israel expanded beyond contested borders as a typical state practice of post-colonial states in the Middle East. Concerning the fallacy of a relapse into Eurocentricity, the critique of Occidentalist thought, particularly within post-colonial theory, should not be misunderstood as a reaffirmation of Eurocentricity. On the contrary, the critique of Occidentalism aims to contribute to, quote, provincializing Europe, end quote. In other words, to decentering global history by exposing the cultural code of Occidentalist anti-modernism as an indelible part of European modernity. Footnote, quote, by the term, quote, historical pseudo-metamorphosis, end quote. By the term, quote, historical pseudomorphous, end quote, I propose to designate those cases in which an older alien culture lies so massively over the land that a young culture cannot get its breath and fails not only to achieve pure and specific expression forms, but even to develop fully its own self-consciousness. All that wells up from the depths of the young soul is cast out in the old molds. Young feelings stiffen in senile practices, and instead of expanding its own creative power, it can only hate the distant power with a hate that grows to be monstrous, end quote. Oswald Spengler, The Decline of the West. End footnote. Oh shit, that's the wrong footnote. God damn it. The actual footnote I was looking for was Chakrabarty, Provincializing Europe, and the article by Volkov, titled Shulamit Volkov, Readjusting Cultural Codes, Reflections on Anti-Semitism and Anti-Zionism. Back to the text. Traces of Occidentalist thought within post-colonial theory could thus be characterized as a case of what Oswald Spengler terms, quote, historical pseudomorphosis, unquote, or the inadvertent adoption of Eurocentric motifs, even in the very critique of Eurocentricity. Walter Mignolo describes the project of contesting Eurocentricity as, quote, decolonial, end quote, thinking, or the conscious, quote, de-linking from the rhetoric of modernity and the logic of coloniality, end quote. Mignolo, in the article, The Rhetoric of Modernity, the Logic of Coloniality, and the Grammar of Decoloniality. Consequently, a de-Occidentalist perspective on Israel could be described as the systematic de-linking from aggressive critiques of modernity that understand Jewish nationalism as an expression of the logic of coloniality. But uncovering these and other Occidentalist motifs can only be the first step of de-Occidentalizing Israel. In order to move beyond analyses that overemphasize Israel's alleged Europeanness, the second step should be the search for alternative paradigms that encompass both Israel and Israel's neighbors. A particularly promising theoretical framework for these comparisons might be historical institutionalism, which is slowly emerging as a paradigm in the discipline of international relations. Let's look this concept up, see if there's anything. According to Wikipedia, historical institutionalism is a new institutionalist social science approach that emphasizes how timing, sequence, and path dependence affect institutions and shape social, political, economic behavior and change. Unlike functionalist theories and some rational choice approaches, historical institutionalism tends to emphasize that many outcomes are possible, small events and flukes can have large consequences, actions are hard to reverse once they take place, and the outcomes may be inefficient. A critical juncture may set in motion events that are hard to reverse because of issues related to path dependency. Historical institutionalists tend to focus on history, longer temporal horizons to understand why specific events happen. The term historical institutionalism began appearing in publications in the early 1990s, although historical institutionalism had been used in the late 1980s. The most widely cited historical institutionalist scholars are Peter Hall, Paul Pearson, Theda Skocpol, who wrote I think he writes on like revolutions, Douglas North, and Kathleen Thelen. Prominent works of historical institutionalist scholarship have used both sociological and rationalist methods. Due to a focus on events involving causal complexity, equifinality, complex interaction effects, and path dependency, historical institutionalist works tend to employ detailed comparative case studies. Back to the text. Historical institutionalism turns to time itself as a dimension of politics, complemented with a specific focus on institutions as, quote, the political legacies of concrete historical struggles, end quote. James Mahoney and Kathleen Thelen, A Theory of Gradual Institutional Change. Published in Explaining Institutional Change, Ambiguity, Agency, and Power, edited by James Mahoney and Kathleen Thelen. In particular, for comparative case studies within the de-Occidentalist paradigm of Israel as a post-colonial state, a more rigorous focus on the long-term effects of political institutions might be a powerful tool for analyzing, quote, colonial institutions as long-run causes, end quote. Mahoney James Mahoney in Colonialism and Post-Colonial Development, Spanish Latin America in Comparative Perspective. The overall research objective of this, quote, close comparison of kindred politics within a geocultural region, as a valuable laboratory for working out explanations of institutional change that may have much broader theoretical application, end quote, can be described as the development of typological theory. Footnote. See Paul Pearson and Theda Skocpol's article, Historical Institutionalism in Contemporary Political Science. And footnote. Typological theory seeks to identify, quote, both actual and potential conjunctions of variables or sequences of events and linkages between causes and effects that may recur. In other words, typological theory specifies generalized pathways, end quote. Footnote. See Alexander L. George and Andrew Bennett, Case Studies in Theory Development in Social Sciences. End footnote. Instead of forcing Israel and Israel's neighbors on a Procrustean bed of implausible homogeneity, typological theory thus focuses on their undeniable differences, but seeks to analyze them as varieties of the same type of phenomenon. New section. Occidentalist motifs in the recent historiography of Israel's occupation. This section criticizes the recent historiography of Israel's occupation on three main accounts that can be traced back to Occidentalist discourse. First, many theoretical accounts of Israeli expansionism suffer from a lack of historicity, which results in, quote, modes of writing that can be called ahistorical history, which purport to address the relationship of past to present, but do so without integrating the way processes unfold over time, end quote. And second, gotta get to the goddamn footnotes, or endnotes, I should say. That's the citation is Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ, that was the quote. That was actually a quote from Jesus Christ himself. Cooper. Frederick Cooper, Colonialism in Question, Theory, Knowledge, History. Second, post-structuralist accounts in particular ascribe only an epiphenomenal role to Palestinian resistance. Third, so far the literature has failed to develop a historically grounded comparative perspective. Existing accounts of Israel's occupation are characterized by a specific form of ahistoricism, breaking out the historicity of Israel's territorial expansion based on the illusion that, quote, all international systems are equivalent, parenthesis, isomorphic, in parenthesis, and have been marked by the constant and regular tempo of a chrono-fetishized present, which paradoxically obscures some of the most fundamental constitutive features of the present international system. End quote. Hobson, what's at stake? That's John M. Hobson. What's at stake in, quote, bringing historical sociology back into international relations, end quote. Transcending, quote, chrono-fetishism and, quote, tempo-centrism in international relations. Despite its allegedly genealogical focus, this form of ahistorical history, most prominent in the, quote, colonialist school, end quote, of Israeli historiography, results in a unique dislocation of the case from time by detaching it from the era of decolonization and post-colonial state formation, and space by bracketing out regional factors of interstate relations in the Middle East. Four specific fallacies of ahistorical history can be distinguished: the apocal fallacy, story plucking, leapfrogging legacies, and doing history backward. Footnote. Cooper, Colonialism in Question. The apocal fallacy describes the anachronistic framing of Israel's expansion as colonial, thereby adopting a historically, culturally, and legally specific framework of foreign domination in order to describe a process in a different time period with a different cultural disposition and a different legal framework. Israel's occupation is distinguished precisely by Israel's occupation's non-colonial features. Historically, in accordance with the normative standards of a post-colonial world, the claim to rule over the captured territories was not was not based on classic European colonial arguments, but on their contested legal status after 2 decades of Egyptian military occupation in the Gaza Strip and unlawful Jordanian annexation, West Bank. Culturally, the expansion process was not based on exploring and conquering foreign lands, but on the re-establishment of a Jewish presence in the West Bank 19 years after the ethnic cleansing of the West Bank's Jewish inhabitants. Legally, Israel never extended its full sovereignty over the area or treated the Palestinian population as colonial second-class citizens, but as a population under military occupation. Footnote. Based on the unique status of the West Bank and Gaza as, quote, territories with no existing sovereign governments, end quote, Israel rejected the de jure applicability of the Hague Regulations and the Fourth Geneva Convention, but declared to conform to a de facto application of non-specified, quote, humanitarian provisions, end quote, of the Fourth Geneva Convention. See Meron Benvenisti, The Dream of the White Sabra, an autobiography of disillusionment. Wait. Hold on. That's not the right thing. Wrong citation. There's another. I don't even know what the hell's his name. Benevisti. And that is Ayal Benvenisti. Ayal Benvenisti, International Law of Occupation, published in 2004. End footnote. This is a terribly formatted paper. I don't like this format at all. It really makes this recording difficult for me, and they should make everything for me, because I'm amazing. Story plucking, or end footnote, story plucking describes the tendency to essentialize Israeli rule based on the notion, quote, that there is an essence of being colonized independent of what anybody did in a colony, end quote. And that quote is from Cooper, Frederick Cooper. By picking and aggregating anecdotal evidence of different forms of control into a timeless depiction of all-encompassing and pervasive supercomplexes of control, some theorists imagine a Foucauldian panopticon whose alleged effectiveness and powerful steering capacity would surprise scholars of complex forms of governance. Footnote. See Elia Zurich, Colonialism, Surveillance and Population Control, Israel-Palestine, published in Surveillance and Control in Israel-Palestine, Population, Territory, and Power. End footnote. Leapfrogging legacies describes the tendency to jump from conditions that are identified as causal factors or historical parallels to the explanandum without taking into account intervening periods. For the literature on the Israeli occupation, there is a systematic tendency to ignore the almost 20 years between state foundation in 1948 and state expansion in 1967, thereby creating the illusion of a seemingly uninterrupted process of territorial expansion that merely differs in tactics but not in substance. Footnote. See Sharif. Gershon Shafir, Zionism and Colonialism, a Comparative Approach. Finally, Doing History Backwards describes the tendency to retroactively smooth out the genealogical trajectory that led to the contemporary constellation of powers. This perspective results in a largely conspiratorial outlook on the history of the Zionist project that jumps uninterruptedly from the, quote, colonization of Palestine, end quote, via the, quote, domination of Arab states, end quote, to the, quote, search for global influence, end quote. See Baylis Thomas, The Dark Side of Zionism, Israel's Quest for Security Through Dominance. And footnote. In addition to a tendency toward ahistorical history, the interpretation of Israel's territorial expansion as a form of European colonialism often goes along with a notion of resistance as, quote, heroic but vain, end quote. Cooper. Despite the broad literature on Palestinian narratives and practices of resistance embedded in a complex strategic culture that stretches from the nativist themes of sumud, parentheses, steadfastness, often symbolized in the olive tree as, quote, the ultimate symbol of rootedness, end quote, and parentheses, to the warrior ethos of nidal, parentheses, struggle, or the, quote, defining quality of the Palestinian culture of resistance, end quote, in parentheses. There is a notable trend in recent theorization of the historical trajectory of the occupation to treat resistance as epiphenomenal. The claim to provide a better analytical focus on power is often the declared point of departure for post-structuralist approaches which, to their credit, sometimes indicate that this endeavor might underestimate the impact of resistance. Footnote. As Lenton notes in her attempt to apply Agamben's theory of a, quote, homo sacer, end quote, that is subject to, quote, sovereign power, end quote, to the Israeli-Palestinian case, quote, such analysis runs the risk of erasing the active agency of the Palestinian subject, represented as either passive victim of Israeli dispossession or aggressive insurgent, but with interpretive control wrested away, end quote. Lenton. In Zuraich's words, quote, mainstream literature on surveillance is not as plentiful on the resistance as it is on the surveillance side, end quote. Zuraich. End footnote. Nonetheless, there is a notable blind spot for Palestinian politics of resistance. One discussion of escalation during the Second Intifada fails even to mention the militarization of Palestinian political violence while merely describing, quote, Israel's underlying project of undermining the Palestinian social fabric while preventing a full-fledged humanitarian disaster, end quote. And that quote is from Adi Ophir, Michal Givoni, and Sari Hanafi. Introduction to the book Power of Inclusive Exclusion, Anatomy of Israeli Rule in the Occupied Palestinian Territories, edited by Adi Ophir, Michal Givoni, and Sari Hanafi. End footnote. But this problem goes deeper than the nonetheless worrisome trend to take relish in post-structuralist nebulosity by defining the occupation regime, for instance, as, quote, an unstable set of technologies of power that open and limit a space of action and reaction for their subjects, end quote. Ophir, Givoni, and Hanafi. Footnote. More than once, one is reminded of the humorous pseudo-pigraph by Frederick Crews, Postmodern Pooh, which lampoons post-colonialist and post-structuralist jargon. End footnote. By ignoring the interactive nature of power relations, post-structuralist theorists are ontologically blind to the processes of political contestation that have shaped the history of the occupation over time. This becomes clear when looking at Nev Gordon's more sophisticated attempt to analyze occupation history and not merely the instruments of control, theorized by other authors, for instance, as, quote, an amalgam of surveillance methods involving Foucauldian, quote, discipline and Deleuzian, quote, control, end quote, or the dimension of institutional stability allegedly caused by, quote, disparate rationalities and mechanisms of power whose heterogeneity reinforces the overall effectiveness and perseverance of this regime, end quote. Zurich in Colonialism, Surveillance, and Population Control. Wikipedia says Nev Gordon, born 1965, is an Israeli professor and fellow of the British Academy of Social Sciences. Nev Gordon is a professor of international law and human rights at Queen Mary University of London and writes on issues relating to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and human rights. He used to teach at Ben Gurion University of the Negev. He is a member of Academia for Equality, an organization working to promote democratization, equality, and access to higher education for all communities living in Israel. Back to the text. But Nev Gordon's historical analysis of Israel's occupation explains changes in Israeli policies of coercive rule as the result of, quote, the interactions, excesses, and contradictions within and among the controlling practices and apparatuses, end quote, thereby ignoring already on the ontological level any potential impact of resistance. Footnote. C. Gordon's Israel's Occupation, published in 2008. End footnote. Finally, the literature fails to develop a regionally comparative perspective despite Michael Barnett's insistence that, quote, not only might Israel and the Arab states share many of the same traits and concerns, but these shared characteristics might have similar origins, end quote. Michael Barnett. Footnote. See Barnett's article, The Politics of Uniqueness, the Status of the Israeli Case, published in Israel Comparative Perspective, Challenging the Conventional Wisdom, published in 1996. End footnote. Regarding research on the Israeli occupation, however, this functionalist understanding of similar causal origins resulting in different yet comparative outcomes is often rejected on the basis of one-sided analyses of Israel's state formation. This ahistorical focus on alleged colonial characteristics of the Zionist project as an explanation for post-1967 expansionism risks sliding into what Mark Bloch calls, quote, the obsession with origins, end quote. Mark Bloch. He explicitly warns against the confusion of historical origins with causal inquiry for political reasons. Quote, in popular usage, an origin is a beginning which explains. Worse still, a beginning which is a complete explanation. There lies the ambiguity and there the danger. ... History oriented towards origins was put to the service of value judgments. ... In many cases, the demon of origins has been, perhaps, only the incarnation of that other satanic enemy of true history, the mania for making judgments, end quote. And that quote is from Mark Bloch, The Historian's Craft. When it comes to research on the Israeli occupation, comparisons between Israel and colonial states, and in recent years increasingly with South African apartheid, often tend to be undertaken by scholars with a specific agenda. The case selection in these comparisons is rarely based on the potential for analytical insight so much as on the potential for denunciation. While one may or may not agree with the normative impetus behind this research objective, as a research method, these comparisons tend to cloud theoretically informed judgment. The problematic nature of analogical thinking also extends to more hybridized frameworks, like the label of Israel as a, quote, immigrant settler society, end quote, seemingly diluting the accusation of colonialism. Footnote. See the article by Baruch Kimmerling titled Jurisdiction in an Immigrant Settler Society, the, quote, Jewish and Democratic State, end quote. End footnote. Like other forms of diaspora nationalism, such as the Greek and Armenian cases, Zionism merely differs from other forms of modern nationalism in the Middle East by its political project of reclaiming for a community, quote, severely fragmented by exile, dispersed, and a minority enclave existence, end quote, a, quote, ancestral homeland, preserved as a symbol and shared memory, and to give it practical shape through processes of liberation and colonization, end quote. And that quote is from Anthony D. Smith in an article titled Diasporas and Homelands in History, The Case of the Classic Diasporas, published in The Call of the Homeland, Diaspora Nationalisms Past and Present. And footnote. Yet this problematic confusion between an immigrant society based on diaspora nationalism and a settler society based on European colonialism permeates comparative studies frequently based on the triad of Zion, Ulster, and South Africa. Footnote. See Thomas G. Mitchell's book, Native versus Settler, Ethnic Conflict in Israel, Palestine, Northern Ireland, and South Africa. End footnote. In a revealing twist to the notion that Jewish nationalism might be a form of settler colonialism, Donald Atkinson turns this notion on its head. Wikipedia says Donald Atkinson is an American historian and author. It's not really, that's all it's really telling me. The rest is kind of just like where he taught and stuff. Based on a Protestant literalist reading of the Mosaic Covenant, which ignores the profound, quote, ambivalence of Israel's election, end quote. Best captured in the notion of the, quote, suffering servant, end quote, the, quote, yoke of the Torah, end quote, Jacob's wrestling with the angel. Atkinson traces both European settler colonialism and Israel's post-1967 expansion back to a time transcending, quote, Hebrew covenantal structure that has lasted from the Middle Bronze Age to the present, end quote. Donald Atkinson. Actually, no, the quote is from... Who's that quote from? I don't fucking know. According to Atkinson, modern-day Israel behaves not only like a settler colonial society, but all settler colonial societies behave like ancient Israel, by following, quote, the conceptual grid for the chosen people's protection of their righteousness, ... not much different from modern racist thinking, end quote. See Donald H. Atkinson's book, God's People, Covenant and Land in South Africa, Israel, and Ulster. And footnote. Consequently, following the role model of the ancient Israelites, alleged settler colonial societies like Israel can safely be assumed to be inherently racist. Quote, we must recognize the horror of, quote, mixing that conventional cultures inherit directly from the Hebrew scriptures, end quote. Arrogant, quote, to keep the deal, that is the covenant, a society must be uncompromising, adamantine, self-contained, end quote. Vengeful, quote, such polities are apt to draw particularly sharp definitions of who their enemies are and to be thoroughly unforgiving to them, end quote, and even prone to human sacrifice, quote, blood sacrifice on behalf of the land and for the benefit of the corporate entity of the Israeli people has developed as a major motif in Israeli popular culture, end quote. Atkinson. Here Israel's Occidentalization comes full circle. Israel is not claimed to be a settler colonial state because of its European origin, but European settler colonialism itself claimed to be Jewish at heart. Is claimed to be Jewish at heart. New section. Towards a typological theory of post-colonial state expansion in the Middle East. What could represent an alternative paradigm to Occidentalist theorizing on Israel's occupation? Particularly attractive comparative cases for the de-Occidentalist perspective on Israel's rule over the territories conquered in 1967 might be Syria's protectorate over Lebanon after its military intervention in the Lebanese Civil War in 1976, and Morocco's partial annexation of Western Sahara since 1975. Marked by two polar types of political incorporation, full-scale incorporation in the Moroccan case, non-incorporation in the Syrian case. They allow a more precise localization of Israel's settlement project on the spectrum of possible policies of expansionism. Other polar types in the Middle East might of course be found in Jordan's unlawful annexation of the West Bank, in contrast to Egypt's mere occupation of the Gaza Strip. three cases of Israel, Syria, and Morocco follow the same general pathway that could be defined as post-colonial state expansion, a phenomenon characterized by the systematic and long-term expansion of post-colonial state institutions across contested borders, and the resulting coercive rule over a neighboring territory and its population. Robert Young defined this overall phenomenon as, quote, comparable but somewhat different kinds of anti-colonial struggles in those countries more recently occupied, end quote, typical for the, quote, post-colonial era, end quote. See Robert J.C. Young, Post-Colonialism, a Historical Introduction. And footnote. In addition to Israel's occupation and the Moroccan annexation, this list also includes Tibet, Taiwan, and Kashmir, which might arguably be complemented with the cases of West Papua and East Timor, or Timor. Typically, this process of territorial expansion is based on post-colonial irredentism. In other words, the notion, quote, in the minds of nationalists that the territory of the state in its present form may not be the homeland, but a part of a larger homeland still to be pursued, end quote. Footnote. Lowell W. Barrington, Nationalism and Independence, published in the book After Independence, Making and Protecting the Nation in Post-Colonial and Post-Communist States. End footnote. In terms of post-colonial irredentism, the three cases even share the considerable gap between territorial maximalism vis-a-vis much more moderate territorial gains. Greater Israel, as imagined by the founder of revisionist Zionism, Zev Jabotinsky, would have encompassed not only the West Bank and Gaza, in other words, all of mandatory Palestine, but Transjordan as well. Greater Morocco, as imagined by Istiqlal founder Muhammad Alal al-Fassi, was supposed to encompass not only Western Sahara, but also large parts of Algeria, Mali, and literally all of the Mauritania and Greater Syria, as imagined by Antoun Saadeh, founder of the Syrian Social Nationalist Party, would have stretched all the way from southern Turkey to the Suez Canal, including Syria, Lebanon, mandatory Palestine, large parts of Iraq and Transjordan, as well as Cyprus. Wikipedia says Alal al-Fassi was a Moroccan revolutionary, politician, writer, poet, Pan-Arabist, and Islamic scholar who was one of the early leaders of the Moroccan nationalist movement, later becoming leader of the Istiqlal Party. He was a, quote, neo-Salafist who advocated for the synthesis of nationalism and reformist Salafism. Alal al-Fassi developed the idea of Greater Morocco, which came to influence the official policy of Morocco. He has been described as the, quote, father of Moroccan nationalism, end quote. He found it, they mentioned his party in the article. The Istiqlal Party is a political party in Morocco. Istiqlal is a conservative and monarchist party and a member of the centrist Democrat International and International Democracy Union Istiqlal headed a coalition government under Abbas el-Fassi from 19th of September 2007 to 29th of November 2011. From 2013 to 2021, the Istiqlal Party was part of the opposition. Since 2021, it is part of a coalition government led by Aziz Akhanuch, or Akhanu. I don't know how to say the name. The party emerged in the year 1937 during the anti-colonial struggle against French and Spanish imperial rule, making it the oldest active political party in Morocco. And let's look up Antoun Saadeh. Antoun Saadeh, who lived from 1904 to 1949, was a Lebanese politician, sociologist, philosopher, and writer who founded the Syrian Social Nationalist Party. Its ideology, Wikipedia says its ideology includes fascism, social nationalism, Syrian nationalism, Syrian irredentism, anti-Semitism. And Wikipedia says the Syrian Social Nationalist Party is a Syrian nationalist party operating in Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Palestine. The Syrian Social Nationalist Party advocates the establishment of a greater Syrian nation-state spanning the Fertile Crescent, including present-day Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, Kuwait, Palestine, Cyprus, Sinai, Hatay Province, and Cilicia, based on geographical boundaries and the common history people within the boundary share. The Syrian Social Nationalist Party has also been active in the Syrian and Lebanese diaspora, for example, in South America. Until the fall of the Assad regime, the Syrian Social Nationalist Party was an ally of the ruling Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party, being the second-ranking party in the National Progressive Front. The National Progressive Front, founded in Beirut in 1932 by the Lebanese intellectual Antoun Saadeh as an anti-colonial political organization hostile to French colonial rule. The party played a significant role in Lebanese politics. It launched coup d'etat attempts in 1949 and 1961, following which it was repressed in the country. The Syrian Social Nationalist Party was active in the fight against the Israeli military during the 1982 Lebanon War and subsequent Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon until 2000, while simultaneously supporting the Syrian occupation of Lebanon due to its beliefs in Syrian irredentism. In Syria, the Social Nationalist Party operated as an ultra-nationalist movement until the 1950s, advocating armed uprising to establish a one-party state. The Syrian Social Nationalist Party participated in the 1949 Syrian coup d'etat, which overthrew the democratically elected Shukri al-Quwatli. The Syrian Social Nationalist Party continued to engage in violent activities throughout the country and was banned in 1955 after the Syrian Social Nationalist Party's assassination of a Syrian Ba'athist military officer, Adnan al-Malki. Despite the Syrian Social Nationalist Party's ban, the Syrian Social Nationalist Party remained organized and by the late 1990s had allied itself with the Palestinian Liberation Organization and the Lebanese Communist Party despite the ideological differences between them. The Syrian Social Nationalist Party was legalized in Syria in 2005 and joined the Syrian Ba'ath Party-led National Progressive Front. From 2012 to 6th of May 2014, The Syrian Social Nationalist Party was part of the Popular Front for Change and Liberation. The party would take the side of the Ba'athist government during the Syrian civil war, where almost 12,000 fighters of its armed branch, the Eagles of the Whirlwind, dismantled in 2019, fought alongside the Syrian Arab armed forces against the Syrian opposition and the Islamic State. Following the fall of the Assad regime, the Syrian Social Nationalist Party was banned by the Syrian transitional government, though it still operates openly in other countries and as well as clandestinely in Syria. Okay, back to the text. Irredentist nationalism, with its obsession with the past, marked by, quote, atavistic feelings for territory and for kith and kin, end quote, is not unique to states emerging from colonial rule. Footnote. That quote was from who? Hevda Ben Israel, Irredentism, Nationalism Re-Examined. End footnote. In fact, irredentism has been a recurring feature accompanying the emergence of newly independent nation-states. Naomi Chazan counts 4 waves of irredentist nationalism, namely the contested delineation of core European states like Germany and Italy in the late 19th century, the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires after World War I, the process of decolonization after World War II, and finally the breakdown of the Soviet Empire. Footnote. See Chazan's article Irredentism, Separatism, and Nationalism, where she notes Chazan notes elsewhere that, quote, the term irredentism, derived from the Italian irredenta, unredeemed, was first used to refer to the Italian movement to annex Italian-speaking areas under Austrian and Swiss rule during the 19th century. It has since come to encompass any political effort to unite ethnically, historically, or geographically related segments of a population and adjacent countries within a common political framework, end quote. Chazan. Also see Chazan's article or that quote is from Chazan in an article titled Approaches to the Study of Irredentism. Back to the text, or end footnote. In the third wave of post-colonial irredentism, however, newly independent states were faced with a new situation in which territorial expansion, while at first attractive and relatively easy to carry out, was normatively and institutionally untenable in the long run. In contrast to colonial-era state expansions, like Saudi Arabia's conquest of the Hejaz, the fateful creation of Greater Lebanon, or even South Africa's control over Namibia, these military conquests conflict with a fundamental normative shift that came to define the post-colonial era, quote, in the sense that it is no longer acceptable for states to take territory against the wishes of the inhabitants and to govern the people there without political representation. Colonialism is over, end quote. Footnote. See Netta C. Crawford, Arguments and Change in World Politics, Ethics, Decolonization, and Humanitarian Intervention, published in 2002. Consequently, in the long run, all 3 cases of territorial expansion failed to become normalized due to the societal norms of a post-colonial world in which, quote, the colonizations of the post-war era extinguished the category of colonial empires from the repertoire of polities that were legitimate and viable in international politics, end quote. Cooper, Colonialism in Question. Based on this explicitly anti-colonial consensus that came to define the institutional framework of the United Nations, policies of expansionism were condemned to failure because of widespread support for different forms of resistance, ranging from armed political violence down to James C. Scott's, quote, infrapolitics, end quote. Consequently, like Israel's rule over the occupied territories, even after almost 4 decades of ongoing annexation and colonization, quote, not a single country in the world recognizes Morocco's sovereignty in Western Sahara, not even Morocco's closest friends and allies, end quote. Footnote. See Yahya H. Zubir's article, Conflict in Western Sahara, published in Interpreting the Middle East, edited by David S. Sorensen in 2010. Admittedly, the approach of comparing really existing, quote, Greater Israel to, quote, Greater Morocco and, quote, Greater Syria is not entirely unproblematic. Putting the 3 cases together means, first of all, taking them out of pre-existing categories. In the Syrian case, this approach would mean delinking Syria's satellization of Lebanon from the category of, quote, protracted military interventions, end quote. Interestingly, however, previous analyses of the Syrian-Lebanese case as a form of military intervention already tend to make a strong case for treating Syria's military presence as a much more systematic form of state expansion. Quote, Syria, in words and deeds, has made it abundantly clear since the crisis began in 1975 that it has never had any intention of getting out of Lebanon, ... From Syria's standpoint, its presence in Lebanon is a fulfillment of historical rights, end quote. Footnote. See the article by Yossi Olmert, Syria and Lebanon, published in the book Foreign Military Intervention, The Dynamics of Protracted Conflict, published by Ariel Levite, Bruce W. Gentleson, and Larry Berman. And footnote. De-Occidentalizing Israel might thus not only help to reconceptualize the Jewish state within its historical and geographic context, the approach could also shed light on the idiosyncrasies of its Arab neighbors. Theorizing a general pathway of post-colonial state expansion seems more adequate to explain Morocco's territorial expansion into Western Sahara than the anachronistic charge of, quote, settler colonialism, end quote. A comparative angle seems also particularly helpful for the Syrian-Lebanese case, still caught between denunciatory accusations and the official Ba'athist euphemism of a, quote, military presence, end quote, that was allegedly, quote, necessary, legal, and temporary, end quote. Footnote. See Blanford, Killing Mr. Lebanon. See Nissan's article, The Syrian Occupation of Lebanon, which compares Syrian rule over Lebanon to the German-Austrian Anschluss, the German annexation of the Sudetenland based on the Munich Agreement, German rule over Vichy France, and finally Stalinism in Eastern Europe. End footnote. Conclusion, final section. A de-Occidentalist perspective on Israel's occupation not only elucidates the shared features of irredentist nationalism and territorial expansion that are relevant for other post-colonial states in the Middle East as well. The analytical value of a regionally comparative perspective on the 3 cases of Israel, Syria, and Morocco consists precisely in highlighting their respective uniqueness. The process of state expansion accentuated the essential dilemmas of each post-colonial state project. In the Israeli case, for mere demographic reasons, This dilemma might be simplified as the trade-off between a Jewish and democratic state, or more precisely between a Jewish ethnocracy and a Jewish ethnic democracy. In the Moroccan case, the denial of Sha'rawi nation exposes a more fundamental unease over other ethnic breaking points, particularly the Berber question. Finally, in the Syrian case, the satellitization of Lebanon exposes the brutality and corruption of the Alawite minority rule in the Ba'ath state. Syria's military withdrawal from Lebanon in 2005 might in fact have been an early symptom of the decline of the Assad dynasty and the subsequent return of the proverbial, quote, struggle for Syria, end quote. Footnote. See the article by Eyal Zisser, titled the, quote, struggle for Syria, end quote, return to the past, question mark, published in Mediterranean Politics in 2012. End footnote. With regard to the broader relevance of a de-Occidentalist research agenda, a stronger focus on the long-term effects of colonial and Ottoman rule as a shared paradigm of Israel and its Arab neighbors might contribute to strengthening intra-regional comparisons, which are currently most developed in the area of state-minority relations, state-diaspora relations, war mobilization, state strength, and the political impact of the security sector. But in addition to Israel's geographic recontextualization of a Middle Eastern state, the historical recontextualization as a post-colonial state might strengthen research on Israel from a trans-regional perspective. After all, Israel shares more and arguably less belligerent characteristics with other post-colonial states outside of the Middle East than just irredentist nationalism and territorial expansion. And that's the end of the piece. It says, I would like to thank Marcus Yachten Fuchs, Eyal Zisser, Derek Penslar, Stefan Stetter, Ava Kizella, and the two anonymous referees for their critical comments. I also want to thank you for listening to this. I know, hearing me check the footnotes and all that stuff is pretty tedious, and especially this where I couldn't even find them very good. So I thank you for listening to the end if you did. And this was a interesting article, but it was also challenging, which is good. I'm glad to be mentally challenged. I guess I'll leave it at that because that was pretty funny. All right, bye.